Okay, good afternoon. Lovely to be here. I think this is exactly the right place where we start to discuss things around food. Old slaughterhouse. Yeah, it looks like that, yes. And when we start to think about the food and the future of food and future of food consumption, I think quite a lot of that discussion has to go around the meat. And of course, this is a place for meat. It's been for a long time. Just to start off with, I mean, the way we should think about this is that in 2050, we're going to have 9 billion people on this planet. And in the course of the last 20 years, the meat consumption in the world has doubled. And according to estimates, it's going to double again in the next 30 years. And that is an equation which is simply impossible, and I think we are all aware of this. And it gives us a kind of a framework through which we could start to think about that. Okay, what are the constraints? But of course, we are not just talking about the constraints, we are talking about also how the food works as a culture and as something that we all like, and how these two things, that we have certain constraints, can meet the idea of the food as something like a pleasure. I think we have basically three dimensions there while we think about food in our times. And the one thing which has, of course, gained a great attention is about the health. So the food as health, and what's the connection between the food and health. And I think if you look at the discussion in the last 10 years, there's been a huge steps forward. I recently read an article about the US food lobbies, how they were able almost for 20 years to deny the fact that it's the sugar that it's really a bad thing. I mean, there are lots of other bad things, but sugar is certainly one of those. By pointing out how fat is the real bad thing about the food. So this lobby that was working for the sugar always blame all defects of the nutrition to the fat. And of course, it was a highly influential, we're talking about the United States now, it was highly influential association and lobbying that had a very clever way to make their way and to support certain amount of the research that was putting up these results which were kind of pointing out that yes, the fat is the bad thing. And I think this went through very interesting way through the general public, and everybody started to think that, okay, let's cut the fat, let's cut the fat, let's cut the fat. And today we know that this is absolutely the wrong way to think about the food as nutrition. The second aspect is about our environment and climate, but I would say more broadly about the resources. And if we think about the connection between the food and the resources, I already started off to talk about that because it's very, very clear to us that when we're talking about the food as production, in many sense, what we see from the clear numbers is that we are coming to the certain kinds of limits. To the extent that the FAO, the World Food Organization, has been doing recently some of the studies that clearly show that there might be something that we call food crisis in 5 or 10 years' time from here, simply because the demand and the supply doesn't go hand in hand, particularly when there is serious problems with the distribution system. So that makes it that whatever, when we think about the food, we have to connect that to the environment, we have to talk about climate change, we have to talk about the issues that will affect in many ways our lives, but particularly on the quality of the soil, because that's the connection that we can find also very, very intimately. And then the third aspect of food has to do with the ethics. And if you think about the connection between the food and the ethics, I think we, maybe in the last, I would say 5 or 10 years, we have started to talk about that connection. I think it was only a fraction of people who 10 or 15 or 20 years ago talk about this connection. Today, it's much more common, and we all understand, and not only us who are interested in food, but also, let's say, men on the street understand that there is actually a strong connection. So things from those perspectives have moved forward. But before I venture out to look at the future of the food, I would like to take advantage to tell you a little bit a kind of a broader view through which I see the next decades to develop. And but I will go that pretty swiftly and then move into food, and then also tell some results of a research that we did, where Johanna was also part, what was making actually scenarios about the food consumption towards the future, because that also tells something about different kind of options that we have for understanding how the food consumption develops. So, okay. Here is just a view that I started to develop. Ulla told that I was working a little bit with the finance and insurance companies in the past, and that brought me to think about, particularly when the financial crisis hit at the end of the last decade, what actually happened. Because that crash was not a usual bank crisis, or it wasn't the usual crisis that happened when markets oversaturates itself and there is an surplus amount of the capital, and then something happens like the crash. This was much more fundamental crash that happened, and it made a couple of things clear. One of the things that it certainly made clear is that if you look the industrial development right from the beginning when it started about 200 years ago, we see that there have been always this kind of a certain phases where certain drivers come and defines the development as a whole. Some economists would say that, okay, it's about increasing the labor productivity, but it's much more fundamental thing, because it also applies what kind of a new professions there are, what kind of a cultures are being created, and of course what kind of technologies are being created, and so forth. So it's the kind of the whole package, you would say, that comes. And to me, when I have been looking at maybe the last 2-3 years quite intensively, what has occurred to me is that when we look now the next era, the next wave, it will be all about materials and energy production and distribution in terms of how to make it more effective, how to make great leap in the productivity of these systems. And the food consumption and production is no different from here. Because everywhere we see, the one problem which is very, very imminent is that we are wasting. We are wasting our resources in so many ways. And that has to become an end. Because there is no point, and our systems cannot anymore hold of that amount of the waste that we are producing. So it's a waste of resources. And I believe that when it comes to develop more intelligent system, how we can deal with that wasting of our resources, we shall see also a very novel ways of thinking about this food production and consumption. In food, if you just think that for acquiring 1 kilo of protein, it would take 69 kilos of beef meat, of cattle actually, to get that 1 kilo protein out of that. Look at the chicken, it would take 24 kilos. And when you go beyond the meat, and you start to look the alternatives, how you can get the same protein out of plants, you get the number of 4 kilos. So you see, in terms of sheer productivity, leave everything out, just take the productivity gains that you have there, it's immense. And that tells me that in addition to these other aspects that we have, the ethics, the environment, and other aspects, there are all these kind of productivity aspects there as well, which also will become more important, not only for us who are interested in food, but those ones who are actually producing that. And I believe that when we look from this perspective, the situation, it's the way to win those minds that doesn't see here any problem in terms of ethics or the issue around the environment or even the issue around the health, to move their heads towards understanding this very basic fact which is there. Oh, it says it's going to be finished. Ah, the Akku is finished. The battery. Maybe it would be just the right time to finish my presentation. Here is the one way just to show, but I'm not going into that now, being conscious about my time. But this next one, but this just tells the complexity of the next era I'm talking about. This one tells a bit more to the point what I'm talking about. So what happened actually, and this goes very much to the agricultural products, but this is the indicator and index for all kinds of commodities in the market. What happened in the course of the last century was essentially the relative decline of the price of those commodities, up until something fundamental happened a bit more than 10 years ago, at the turn of the century, when the Asia became a global player, and particularly China rose. And what happened was that this trend was abruptly changed radically to shoot up to the skies. And this is, of course, something that you find, you go to any farmer in any developing countries that has the connection to the market, and he would reflect this, what has happened, because that has meant many things. And this is kind of a trend that is not going to be anywhere vanishing out. It's going to be intensifying, even though there is a lot of oscillation there. And what's more, all these different commodities we're talking about, they are much more connected to the one thing, namely to the use of oil. And this brings also another aspect to how we run our agriculture and farming in the future. Because this is the source of the great distress, I would say, to the farmers, and I would say also to the system. So if you look at the energy intensity of the farming in the last couple of decades, you can see that it's been intensifying. The material and energy intensity of this farming has been going up. And this has a fundamental impact to the agriculture, to the food production, and so forth. And then we take another constraint, which you all know about, and this is about what's happening because of the climate change, because of the global warming, because of the rise of the average temperature. What happens really is the kind of a desertification of the key farmlands on a global basis. And all of these scenarios that has been built, and I've been working with the climate change research for the last 20 years, all of these simulations actually just show that we are into the beginning of something. So it's really the last moment to act. Because if we let the climate and the warming to climb up to this degree, or the 4 degree, on which this simulation is based, you see these red and violet areas there in these later time frames, and it clearly shows that that we have an immense problem there. So let's look at the food production as meat production, because I think, as I said in the beginning, there is this focus quite a lot about meat. Of course, it's not only meat, but it's a good indicator of what has happened. And again, if you look at here, you can clearly see that there has been simply a very rapid increase of the consumption of the meat in its various forms. And here perhaps is quite revealing diagram which shows that exactly when the China started to rise and the wealth had started to be created in a very much more intensive way, what really happened was this tremendous increase of the meat consumption. Whereas the U.S. markets have been already to quite extent saturated, and in fact, in the last years, it's been the consumption has been going down, which is a positive sign indeed. But this is what has happened, and if you think about the future, and what I said in the beginning, that it's been doubling in the last 20 years, more or less, and it's going to be doubled in the next 30 years up until 2050. This kind of a curve is simply something that we cannot sustain. So something fundamental has to happen. Now, we all know that it will happen, but which way it will happen, that's another thing. And for this, I very shortly will show 4 different scenarios that we built in our project that I mentioned about, which was about, we did this together with the Finnish food industry and Finnish Ministry of Agriculture at that time, where we wanted to together kind of find what are the kind of types of consumption scenarios that would help them to reorientate their service. And if we take the first one, which is more like I would say like a business as usual model from here, you see this what we call the cornucopian future of food consumption, where we are going to see developments that have to do with what we already see now at our plate, so to say. So, so there are issues like aging of the population, cooking as a pleasurable hobby, which certainly has become, picking up the waste of the food, multiculturality coming in the different forms. This is kind of a spread of issues that we will certainly will see to intensify in this kind of a scenario. So, crystallizing this, you see these kinds of sub-themes that are coming up and will intensify in the context of this kind of a scenario. Now, then there is a scenario number 2, which is about the ecological practices guiding food consumption. So this is, as the title says, it's much more going into understanding the ecological limits, thereby a lot of different issues that will intensify when we think about how we take these constraints in our food consumption into consideration. And thinking also perhaps that Finland would be particularly favorable for this kind of a food consumption. Maybe here a couple of issues that that we sort of found out from there, which I think are pretty obvious. Now, the third one is then assumably something that Johanna will talk about more about later, but it's really about the scarcity and shortage. So it's the scenario in which generally it means that there is a more increase in the food prices, but also a kind of a new social and societal issue that we haven't perhaps seen before. Or we have seen that before, but we have to go back in time for quite a lot. And here are some issues that are connected to this sort of development. And if you think about the good or bad sides of this, maybe it would then at least make us to think a very new way that what is kind of a national food security mean, because that's one of the topics that I think we should have much more in our thinking about the food production in terms, even though we don't have to think ourselves as being the country secluded from the others, but I think there are certain issues around the food security that should be considered with ourselves. And then the fourth scenario was then this techno-life and food, and of course it's everything about how this in vitro meat issue. I have been working in the past with this Wageningen University, who has been working on this topic for, I don't know, for the last 15 years or so. So they have been very enthusiastic about it. And I'm myself a bit suspicious about it, but let's see. The project is still in its beginning. And you might think that in this kind of a scenario, there are some elements which probably inevitably are with us. And since the innovation front here is, of course, also moving forward as we speak, but let's if we look at what are the kinds of the issues here that we have sort of picked up, it's this kind of a vision perhaps that was there maybe 20 to 30 years ago when we were talking about that time, about the future of food, we thought that we're just taking pills or something, and that's the way to, you know, to find solution for these global issues. And of course, we today think this is pretty much naive to think in those terms. But something which has to do with how to be innovative on this front, I experienced that very personally last autumn. I was, you know, these guys, these Mad Venture, Doc Venture guys, these Riku and Tunna. I happened to be one of their shows when we were talking surprisingly about the future, and then they sort of surprisingly started off this show by giving me a plate and said, "Come on, guys, and now it's time to have our food before we start to discuss about it." And there were insects there, and it took me a while before I was able to swallow it. But they were sort of insisting, yes, this is also the part of the future. I don't know if it's a part of the techno future or what future it is, but of course that's something many people are considered today, that that's the kind of a solution to this protein problem. Okay, then I would like to show you a little video clip. I don't know if we get the voice to that as well. We do. Okay. Yeah. I'm sure that in this audience there are not that many guys who likes Bill Gates. Well, we say that, well, Bill Gates is really down. Yeah. He's a past guy and terrible guy. But what I would like to show to you, if that is possible, to show one video clip that I've found from his kind of a blog page, which was an interesting account of the future. Can you? Okay, then there is the next one. I want one more if I can torture you. Our friend Bill Gates. The interesting thing about this is that that instead of thinking that these plants and meat is different in terms of how we taste them, what they have really done is that they have used plant protein to make it taste like chicken, which goes much more into this kind of ordinary folk. So you can have them already in the United States in the Whole Foods shops and in some other stores as well. And I think this is also one way to overcome this kind of a gap which is between use of the plants as the source of not only nutrition but the source of, you know, food as delight versus meat. So just to show you one way to sort of solve the problem. But I think now my time has come, and if you have any comments or questions, I'm delighted to talk about.
Hey, I have just one question, that why we consume too much meat? What's the reason that we use too much meat? Is it cheaper? Is it more delicious? Or what's the reason that we use it, that we try to somehow replace it with other products?
I think it has to do with our concept of how different foodstuffs are connected to the level of the standard level of our life. And when I showed you this curve that showed the sudden increase of the meat consumption in China, that obviously has the direct correlation of the amount of the wealth that has been produced and the rise of the middle class that has been there. So we just connect these two things together, and that's why it becomes a problem.
So it means that wealthier will eat more meat?
Yeah, at least to a certain extent. At some point, maybe that's not possible anymore, but particularly when you go to the more poor conditions, to the what we call the middle class condition, then make that path. The meat is a part of that path, has it been.
But you know, it really depends to the geographical issues, aspects as well. For example, in Finland, vegetables and herbs are more expensive than meat. You know, you can buy beef cheaper maybe than herbs that most of them imported or they produce here, they grow here. So rationally, you know, you should use meat here in Finland, not herb. And it's a wealthy country, so people should consume meat because it's wealthy. But wealthy people, they try to have better diets and they consume more vegetables.
Yeah.
I don't understand, you know, it's kind of conflict. Why we use meat, you know? Is it cultural or?
I think it's very much cultural, and probably Johanna is going to address the cultural aspect of food, and I'm sure that she's much better in actually solving the problem that you were issuing.
I just wanted to say, is it really the true price of the meat, though? I mean, what we're seeing, you know, when you get a special price chicken, what are you paying for? So whether the meat is more expensive, is cheaper because it should be, or is cheaper because of tax cuts, or, you know, things that aren't right with that production of that meat. I was going to ask, do you think it's really, I mean, I've been vegetarian all my life. I've never tasted meat. I have no desire to. And surely wouldn't it be better to kind of educate people on the joys of vegetables than try and create a product that simulates something that I don't see a need for?
Well, you don't see. But I think if we really want to change this curve, we have to use all the possibilities that there are. And this is just one of them, but there are others. But I don't simply think that people wake up one morning and they are completely different in the ways that they appreciate meat or non-meat. Of course, the best way would be if this would happen, that one day they thought, well, how crazy we have been that we have been using so extensively meat. But I think that we need to have other strategies there if we want to see any change to happen.
I wanted to ask you, Charlie, because you say that you never tasted meat. When you were a child, how did you manage to avoid this social pressure not to eat meat? Because when you are a child, maybe somebody, a relative or somebody says that now you have to eat meat. How was it?
I guess my whole family is vegetarian, so maybe that was easy. But I've never wanted to. I don't see the necessity for it. My mum's a nutritional therapist, so she's always been telling us everything about the importance of eating vegetables. So yeah, I never felt that social pressure.
So you never tried meat?
Well, not to my knowledge.
I would like to know, where do you see the meat consumption / protein consumption of the people in Finland going in the next 30 years? Like, from what sources? I mean, like in your lecture, you emphasize that, you know, meat consumption is going up and new foods may come up or something like that, you know. there were some glimpses about that. So as you're in Finland and you are in this field, like how do you see this protein consumption source or the protein source coming to people in the next 30 years? Would it be meat? Would it be some new foods? Would it be insects? Would it be, you know, you get me, maybe some engineered food or something? Where do you see that?
Well, as I tried to emphasize, the starting point is that from somewhere we need to get the proteins. I think this is what everybody agrees, and then the issue is where do we get that? And food consumption itself, because it's very heavily culturally defined thing, and when we go to the details of the food consumption, every country, of course, has its own traditions and own ways, and we always have to keep this in mind. So there is no overall kind of way of universal way of consuming food. Having said this, if you look at the Finland's case, for instance, you can see that there has been, for instance, quite dramatic increase of the chicken as a source of meat. That's one thing, but this is happening actually elsewhere. Because if you look closer also to these estimates towards the future, it's the amount of the chicken meat that is going to rise mostly. And this is, of course, the part of the health propaganda that has been there, and which is, of course, one way to kind of make the diet lighter. But but it depends from which perspective you look at the thing. This is a real solution? I don't think that that's a solution. That's maybe a bit way forward. But the very same moment you might ask, you know, what the hell is happening with this chicken, that they are really having these horrible conditions that they have been raised. So that's even worse, the situation in most of these the chicken farms, that it has been with this other animal farms. So that's something that we need to think, because this is a combination of these issues. And I don't know, I can't say if I remember right, but I think Johanna is again the real expert of the Finnish food consumption, and can tell what are the kinds of scenarios for different varieties of protein source and nutrition for. But I leave it to Johanna to to respond to that.
Yeah, because let's say from a technical point of view, when I consume food, taste is always one thing, but then also we'll always consider that what this food actually contains. Does it have a lot of proteins? Because you know, if you're an engineer or maybe for technical background, you will always, in a way, think like that. So that's why I was quite curious to know that. But
yeah, understand.
Thanks. I would like to know your opinion on genetically modified organisms. What are the threats and what are the possibilities linked to those?
Well, I'm not really an expert on that, I must say. To me, I'm always felt quite suspicious about that. But to be honest, I'm not expert really enough to say, to very clear cut of what are the real issues around that. I think we simply have to be cautious, because what we know about the genetically modified food is, and the growing of that food is that the moment we start to do that, the moment we are ourselves in a kind of a laboratory, so we don't really know the impacts. So I think that's one of the reasons that why we have to be very cautious about using, and that's why Europe, in fact, has been very cautious in allowing those kinds of seeds to use, and I think it's been rather wise.
Genetic modification will not be a solution for any type of food production problems. I think that that's absolutely clear. It is just a playground for some people, nothing else. It won't mean anything economically valuable. And that was just a point to this last discussion. And then I would like to comment that I think that in those graphs, what you were showing about energy consumption for farming, and it was clearly indicated that it will be increasing and increasing. And I think that right now, when we are in the beginning of climate change, that we have to totally re-evaluate the ways how we are farming. In that sense, climate change will be extremely good thing because it forces us to make changes. And I think that also the ways to produce, especially plant protein, it is possible to develop it so that we are consuming less energy for that part. And I think that also the ways how really people may enjoy different taste world, it will be opening. Meat will be considered like an old-fashioned, or well, perhaps elderly men will enjoy it, but they would die very fast. So it won't last
There are
such
new
a long
elderly
time.
men coming. Yes, thank you anyway.
Yeah.
Comment.
I have a question about politics and solving problems. So we know that, like from your presentation, that from the CO2 emissions, meat production accounts for about half, right? Okay, so what's the kind of political force that's stopping us from addressing this problem? Like, we have all the tools. We can use taxation. We can use all kinds of instruments to cut down the meat consumption. Why do you think we don't do this?
Well, good question, but I think the answer to that is that what are the political priorities, to put it broadly.
I mean, we have emission trading. We have all kinds of like. We're trying to do many other things. We're trying to boost solar power, wind power, whatever. We are spending money on this, but why aren't we addressing this problem that's accounting for half of our emissions?
I think it's a very much similar thing that why are we not more supporting biodiversity as a solution for actually sucking out the CO2 from the atmosphere into the plants, which we could do and which could be supported in the same way. We haven't done it because it's been always kind of in the marginal of this climate change, international climate change negotiations. But I think we will come to that point the more we realize that these are actually the kinds of issues that we can really tackle, and that it may and it can make a huge difference. But I think the time has not been ripe for that yet. But certainly I agree that it's an important connection, and I also believe that it will come.
I have a question about, know how to formulate this, but I suppose, because I didn't do one, but if you do insurance for life insurance or health insurance in the private company, you are asked many questions from gender to different things. Are they already asking what are your eating habits, or what kind of what kind of food you are eating?
Well, I think we are not in that stage as yet. Now, how the insurance companies usually react on these is that they start to think about should there be a kind of a crop insurance for the farmers. So if the climate starts to become more volatile, and so there is a danger for them to lose their harvest. So it's more going on to that kind of rationale. But I could say the same thing, as I said before. I think this is something which will come because it would only make sense for the insurance companies. And actually, when I was working in Allianz in Munich, I was promoting that, but I clearly saw that there was not much response from the side of the organization. It would be much more rational way, actually, to to think about the health insurance, to see that, you know, what are your ways of life, and have a kind of a risk profile based on that, and then have a different premiums for people who who are taking care of their health versus those that don't. That would be only rational from the side of the company, but it was, they somehow didn't like the idea.
But could they control that? People could lie what they eat.
Well, then of course there has to be some kind of a mandate from the doctor or something which says that, you know, this has been proven.
Thank you. I think the scenarios that you presented were really interesting, and I'm kind of worried about which road we will take, because I'm sure that the consumption of meat will go down eventually, but if it's the road of like scarcity and shortage of food, then that's quite a sad road to take. So I'm hoping we will take another one. But I think it's a matter of like political will, and we're lacking political will to solve this problem at the moment. It's not popular to tell people what they can eat or what they should do, and it's the same thing as with climate change negotiations, that no country wants to be the only one doing something, because food is, or maybe meat is related to like the wealth, and no one wants to be the only country that to tell their citizens to like live differently. So as with climate change, we also need kind of, I think we should try to get like a large worldwide consensus on how we will try to solve this problem. But also it's related with if we get a good deal from the Paris meeting for climate change things, then the countries will have to also address the meat consumption, because it does have a big part in CO2 as well.
Yeah.
There was no real question, just a comment.
No, good comment. Thank you.
One more question? Who wants to make it? No? Then I make it. So if the future researchers know things that will happen in the future, do you have, what are your means to change the shift of the future to the direction that is for example, your values? Or do you have a means to make the world go to the direction that you want to?
I wish I had, but I don't, I think, to be honest. But I think the only way is just to deliver the insight and foresight in the way that we see things happening, and make every best effort to disseminate this, what we think is important. And I think it's particularly important to see in our times, now that we are changing from kind of a representative democracy into a more direct democracy. So our kind of political system is changing quite dramatically, and we should see that there is an advantage actually to make the impact and to be influential in a very different way in the future. And I also believe that nothing changes unless there is a critical mass that wants this change to happen, and that's what history actually teaches us. So I think you guys are part of that critical mass that will make the change.
Thank you, Markku.